So what I want to talk to you about today is a study that I did on Singapore and Finland. Thank you, very good. And I think I'm glad there's someone here that cares about Singapore. This is one of my favorite places to visit and shop and now also do research. But the reason I'm talking about these two institutions, of course, new universities open every day, right? And in India, probably 5 in the time that I started talking. So why is it worth talking about 2 new institutions, 2 new universities opening? And the reason is because in both of these cases, these institutions play a huge role in their national policy, in their narratives about education and about their goals for higher education. Oh, and how do I just click here? Yeah. So I wanted to think about, one of the things I'm very interested in is how globalization is impacting higher education. But I wanted to do it a little bit different in this study. Some of you know my work on Singapore before, thanks. I think you and my mom read that book, but and my mom didn't get all the way through it. But anyway, in that study, I was really looking at how globalization was impacting Singapore. And in this study, it was something a little bit different because I wanted to take a comparative approach. So I was using globalization as kind of the common set of circumstances, and then I wanted to compare the way that these 2 nation states were responding to those circumstances. And what I found was that both of them were developing these 2 new institutions that looked remarkably similar in many ways, which worked really well for these kinds of questions, which are the type of things that I like to study. Now, when I talked about this presentation at AERA and CIES, I didn't really talk about my own interests as much as I'm going to today. I wanted to kind of fill you all in on the types of things that I like to study. So as we go forward and maybe have classes together or things, you'll kind of know where my areas of interest are. And I know that with some of you, I'll be doing some research later together. So I wanted to kind of show you where I'm coming from. So first of all, I'm obviously very interested in the global context for higher education and how it functions at the local level. And looking at what are the national and local purposes for higher education, and then how that changes over time, or how global influences impact those national and local purposes. Then I'm also really interested in how do we see US models being used or employed around the world in different circumstances. And in this case in particular, I was looking at convergence and seeing, is it coerced? Can we see it as emulation, or as an example of agency and just some ideas circulating among elites? And then I was also looking to see in what way do we see global policy convergence? Is it evidence of national and local education systems giving up their own ways of doing things and taking on this more global perspective, or are they still doing things in their own way? So here I'm really getting at ideas of the power of nation state and to what extent that's still there. Sorry, I don't know how to use this thing very well. I'm not really a Mac person. Okay. So what we find in both instances is both Singapore and Finland consider themselves innovation hubs. They consider themselves that, and everyone else seems to be in agreement wherever you look. These are nations that have dramatically transformed their economies, and they've done it in large part by using their education systems to fuel that dramatic change. Innovation hubs, those are not the only 2 examples. They're all over the world, right? And everybody's claiming to want to be one. There's popping up everywhere. And here's sort of a generic way of thinking about what they might be. Jane Knight is someone who's done a lot of work in this area. But in general, we can see it as a center of innovation. It includes higher education, other research institutes, researchers, the people that it brings together. All enveloped in a warm and supportive policy culture. And around the world, again and again and again, the example that we hear, and the 2 examples that I studied, Finland and Singapore, are no exception, is MIT and Stanford. MIT especially is the worldwide model for an innovation hub. You'll see this showing up in policy documents. You hear it in presidents' or leaders' speeches. It's everywhere, MIT, MIT, MIT. And we also have thought about this some in global studies in terms of world class. You know, often there's this overlap between world class and these American models. And what I want to draw your attention to today as we begin to talk about this study is that this is not a neutral model, right? We know that world class, you know, has embedded in all of these hegemonic Western ideals. But MIT itself, and Stanford as well, and the American model of higher education is not a neutral model. There's a large body of research that has shown the impact of Department of Defense, US military spending on American higher education. Now, MIT is a very standout example of this, but even our own institution, you know, if you look at the dollars that come into any sort of large research institution such as this one, you can see it's a dramatic impact. And critics would argue, and many would argue, and I think it's hard not to see that that's obviously going to have an impact, isn't it? Where the funding is where the studies are. So when certain types of knowledge are being privileged for research, for study, for the pursuit of that type of knowledge, that's the kind of knowledge that gets developed. And you know, obviously. Now, engineering is the main discipline that has been implicated in this triangle so far, and we really think of it as a triangle. It's the, you know, academic side is one pillar of that, and typically it's engineering, chemical engineering, other areas like that. The military, the government, military especially, Department of Defense, and then industry. And those are the three areas working together that have really comprised what it means to have scientific knowledge and have developed certain types of science being privileged while other types of science are not. And so we can think of just millions of examples of things that have been developed, weapons, other technologies used for weapons or that type of thing, while other knowledge is not being pursued for, say, for example, diseases, or you can think it through on your own, but you get the idea that when this becomes then a worldwide model for innovation hubs, we need to keep in mind that it's not a neutral model and it comes with a lot of baggage. So I want to talk about these two institutions. And first of all, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that they were developed, you know, almost exactly at the same moment. And they're separated only by months in the time that they were born or began. In Singapore, it was Singapore University of Technology and Design. And this was developed in a very strong partnership with our friends at MIT. It claims to be the first university in the world to integrate the concept of design and innovation into research and engineering. And the main goal, the goal that is stated over and over in policy document after policy document, is that it's going to be the intellectual hub and engine of growth for Singapore. Now, at the same time, exactly the same time, in Finland, very different culture, very different place, and look at what we have happening. Once again, we have a new university being developed with a mission to contribute to a better world and a national mission to increase the competitiveness and welfare of Finland. And if you compare the policy documents, it's amazing the number of similarities that we see in the way that these two universities are described. Now, Aalto did it a little bit differently. They blended together three campuses that they already had. But look at who the players are: technology, economics, art and design. So again, we see the similar players being employed to encourage this sort of mission of competitiveness, economic competitiveness at a national level.
Can I?
Yes, please.
But what I'm understanding you saying is that the American model is based on the defense industry, but that's not, and that's not because that's because of the way the United States is set up. You can also support industry and technology without it being through, it's just that the US has no way of doing it without doing it through defense, right?
Well, I think what we have happening here is that this the U.S. model is really being adapted and adjusted. It's still aimed at national competitiveness, but if you look at here, what we're seeing is they're not trying to gain military dominance.
Right.
It's now about economic dominance. So it's still the same.
In the US, economic and military are very tied together because it's one of the ways that the government can interact, can intercede in the economy.
Yes.
There are other ways that they can do it. That's what they use the military to do that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, and I'll talk about the U.S. example in a minute, but you know, I think what's interesting here is that the way that it has shifted, that model, I mean, you're exactly right, the model has shifted. They're not trying to build up a strong, you know, military through this, but what they are trying to do is to serve, you know, to create a strong national state, but doing it through this economic growth. So yes, you're exactly right. I mean, it's
knowledge-based economy.
Exactly. So for this study, I did want to talk about just briefly about the methods. Most of it was looking at documents, but I did have some interviews as well. And just to kind of follow up on some of the things that you were talking about with the interviews, I found that you know, there's this problem, right, when you're coming from the U.S. as a researcher, because you're coming from this position of privilege, this privileged higher education system, and you're going into this other place, and to negotiate that does create some challenges. I felt that as we get further, you'll see that, you know, really in Finland there was much less emphasis on MIT or U.S. models. But I almost felt that my presence there made them feel obligated in some way to mention the U.S. models and to credit them more than maybe they would have if they weren't talking to me. You know, and part of that was my mistake in how I handled the interviews. You know, it's very difficult when you're going to another country. You want to be polite, and you know, so I was probably a little bit too friendly or conversational maybe in the manner in which I conducted that interview. I'm thinking especially of the Ministry of Education in Finland because you know, I started off by complimenting them so much on their K through 12 education, and I had some stats I was quoting about how great they were, and that led them to then, out of politeness, turn around and say, oh, but your higher ed is so excellent, MIT, and you know, so I blew it with that, but and you know, so all my data is tainted, but but you get the idea that, you know, when you're coming from the U.S. and going into another place and you're doing these kind of policy interviews, you know, I really felt like the document analysis was more reliable in terms of what was really happening, because I think probably if I were more experienced, I would have been better at getting real data, but I did a terrible job at that. So. And it was great going and talking to them. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was really fun, and it was a great just conversation, but in terms of data, I really just relied mostly on the documents. So anyway, I want to get back to Singapore now, and some of you already know about my other research in Singapore, but this sort of grew out of that. I was really interested in the development of this institution. When I first heard about it, it didn't really, I didn't care about it, you know. I was thinking more at their whole policy level and their partnerships with this university, so I was thinking about that, but this just kept staying in the back of my mind. And I finally did get the chance to go back and investigate a little bit more, and it became really fascinating because it so embodies everything that Singapore does from a policy perspective. It is exactly the embodiment of their global schoolhouse policy in that it totally relies on foreign expertise. MIT develops the curriculum. MIT sends faculty. MIT designs the courses. There's all sorts of money being exchanged to MIT for this. MIT helps them set up this International Design Center, on and on and on. The faculty go to MIT and spend some 6 months, a year in training at MIT. So it is very, very, very steeped in MIT. Now they also have a Chinese university that's a partner, but it in no way plays this heavy role that MIT does. And it's not just in name, you know, they're not just saying this on the documents. MIT is deeply involved in the actual creation of this institution, and in a very deep and, you know, even down to the curriculum and the courses. Now, in contrast, look at the way Aalto was developed. It's very different because they went to, instead of going out and getting foreign sources of expertise, they turn in. And instead, they go get 3 institutions of their own and bring them together. So it becomes this interdisciplinary change that they're trying to create. Rather than going and getting some foreign university to come in, as many countries around the globe have done, instead they turn to their own expertise and try to just bring together different disciplines in order to create something new. Now in 2010, it's really been interesting because Finland at that point put all their funding, all their university funding into performance-based funding. In other words, if you, depending on how well you do what the government has required, that directly impacts all the funding that you will get as an institution. Wow, that's a huge shift because, you know, we tried to do this in Illinois, and I think it was 8% or something of the funding, and it just turned into this giant, you know, just huge mess with all of the universities fighting and clawing and scrapping over this 8% that was going to be decided on performance-based measures. They're doing all of their funding that way, and so it's an enormous shift. But what it does is really tighten that relationship between government and higher education and industry. And in not only in the documents, but also in the interviews, it was very clear that the relationship there that we conceive of as a triangle with, you know, the 3 different sets, for them they kept using the word circle, not just to describe this, but to describe the policy environment in general in Finland, because they're so closely connected. It's such a small group that works so closely together that it's a very tight circle, they kept saying over and over. And I thought that was really interesting because it shows how tightly wound those relationships are between industry, and by industry I mean Nokia. That's who it is, right? I mean, they're all about supporting Nokia in whatever way they can, supporting their local industries very strongly. So they went about this in a very different way. Now, for those of you that are interested in networks, this is a really interesting place to study because they are very involved. They've Castells, you know, is a big part of their policy world. They think very much about clusters and networks, but I think they do it in a very unique Finnish way. You know, if you think about a circle, that doesn't really work well for creating a network, does it? There's nothing going out of a circle. A circle is by nature closed. And so I thought it was really interesting that they would, at the same time as talk about their tight policy network internal, it doesn't really have any outward reach in the way that we would see, for example, in Singapore, that is so outwardly directed. So if we just look at the 2 and kind of contrast the way that they have developed their institutions, in Singapore, we know that university funding is in no way market-based. They fully fund their universities, and there is no competition about it. You just get funded. You don't have to compete or do any certain thing. You're going to be well-funded. Also, their research is funded, but in a very targeted and instrumentalist way. So the famous quote is, you know, we're not going to fund studies to find out how the butterfly flies. They don't care about that. They're going to fund studies that are going to directly result in economic benefit for their nation. They're very, very focused on a global network. They bring in expertise. All of their expertise is brought in from outside, and local institutions are expected to learn from that. And critics have said that this is actually hampering them in the long term because they're not allowed to develop their own expertise. Instead, they're always pulling in from the outside. We might contrast that with you know, somewhere like Japan or Korea in terms of industry. You know, think about those kind of places where they have really tried to develop their own level of entrepreneurship. And so they have a Toyota, you know, where Singapore is always pulling in from the outside, and so never really develops its own sustaining expertise. And for Singapore, international students are just a part of that network. They're not seen as a source of revenue or in any way part of the market. They're really seen as, you know, can you come here and what will you do for us when you're here? How will you help us extend our global networks? That's really the purpose that they have. And we know this because they're fully funded. The government doesn't expect money from the students. The government pays certain students to come. So it's a very different approach. In Finland, now all university funding is market-based. The universities sort of have to compete against each other to try to get the biggest share of the funding. So it's really different. Their basic research, however, is funded, and they do take a long-term view. So studying how the butterfly flies, they're just fine with that. They'll study anything, thinking that maybe sometime down the road, you can have some benefit from that. We don't yet know what the benefit of knowing how the butterfly flies is. We'll go ahead and study that. We'll invest deeply in research and just see what pans out, assuming that later we're going to see the benefit of it. And their networks are very national, as I mentioned. They're really closely knit, and their policy arrangement is very, very tight and internal. They do, however, see international students as an export. It's the old Australian language of, you know, the export industry. They believe that they cannot lure large numbers of people to Finland because it's dark half the year and freezing, and so they might be right. But and also there's the problem with Finnish language. You know, it's not something you just pick up overnight. So what they do instead is set up English language programs in other countries and enroll students and generate revenue in that way. So in an interesting twist, MIT, and notice the year 2011, has now developed a Center for Art, Science, and what? Technology. So following the models that were created abroad, were created internationally, now MIT itself has become one of the players in this new configuration. And I thought it was interesting. I just wanted to put a couple of their quotes up here because this really captures you know, sort of American education and our our claims at being the best. Says one of the only institutions that can combine internationally recognized excellence in science and engineering with a strong and deep heritage in design. I think that's interesting since they set up the other one, you know, and then establish a model for collaboration among artists, scientists, and engineers. Wow. So MIT is following the other two examples that I gave you. And I don't know, you know, part of me thinks I was supposed to go and get to do a study here, and then there was the bombing in Boston and things got canceled. But I think it would be interesting to see if they're late or are they just slow? Because, you know, things take forever in a campus like this. And so they may have been in the works to get this center developed, and it just took a long time to get through the various committees that have to happen on a campus in America, where in Singapore or Finland things can turn on a dime, literally. You know, the government decides something and it is. Here it's because of faculty governance and the way we do things, it takes a very long time to establish. So it could be that they're just slow, or it could be that they're now copying. The teacher has become the student, I don't know. But so I think there are some important areas for future study here, and that I really hope I can get to maybe next fall. One of the most important things, I think, is what does it mean for the discipline of design to be recruited into this triangle? So we have seen engineering be very corrupted, you know, by the direction that it has taken because of this government funding and this government influence in the form of the Department of Defense. What does it mean for design now to be pulled in and used for national purposes? How will that change what it means to be a designer or to study design, art design for students now? And how will that change the direction that that knowledge takes? And I think this is really important because as we've seen, you know, that's 3 examples, and one of them being MIT. This is a model that is going to be replicated around the world. And so to get back to your neoliberalism, I think, because all conversations lead there, right? I think it's important to think about the ways that now corporations, it's not really the Department of Defense, right? It's corporations that are deciding who is of national importance. And they have decided, apparently, that design is. And giving them that sort of power over this discipline now, I think is something we need to think about and consider. And I think we also need to think who's next. You know, we're probably safe in education policy, but there are going to be other disciplines that get recruited in, and we want to think about what that does to the direction that knowledge takes. And I also would like to know, you know, where else in the world do we see this similar configuration? Because I'm sure it's out there. So that's really what I wanted to talk about with this study. But I wanted to show you just real quickly before I finish. I think I'm running late. But I wanted to tell you kind of how I'm taking that study that I just completed and now moving into my next areas of research, in case any of you are interested and want to participate or work with me on any of these things. So one of the things I'm really interested in is this comparative factor of looking at how these global forces create a situation, but then we compare how it's responded to, and then using really comparative theories to analyze how that happens. And so the one that I am working on this summer is looking at the Copenhagen process, you know, not the Bologna Accord, but Copenhagen, where it's the vocational training, to look at the policies around that and compare that to the new policy initiatives in the US around community colleges and workforce training, to see in what ways we can see similarities and sort of who's following who there, because I'm really not sure if the US is copying these European models or is it the other way around. And then I'm especially interested in that because of who it impacts in this country. The people who tend to go to community colleges, you know, it's often people who don't have a lot of other choices. And so I think it's important for us to consider to what extent they're becoming pawns in this global army to build for these corporations, for this global workforce, and what that does at the individual level for people's lives. So that's one of the things I'm working on this summer. And then the other thing, and I'm doing this with some of you in the group, is looking at the role of partnerships. I'm interested in, you know, the way MIT plays abroad, but also this campus. You know, we do this a lot too. We have a lot of relationships abroad with other campuses, with other research partnerships, all sorts of things. And there are a lot of implications for those that really need to be carefully considered. So the case that I'm looking at now is really interesting to me. It's this community college or like a community college. It's a junior college in Hong Kong that is going to send students to Richland Community College, which is in Decatur, so a 1+1. Then the following 2 years will be at ACES here at UIUC. So I think that's a really strange new twist on university partnerships, and it shows once again how community colleges are getting pulled into these global ideas about higher education and these global demands, which is interesting because community colleges by their very nature are community, right? They're supposed to be very locally bound. They're locally funded. They're serving local students. They are supposed to meet local employer needs, if anything, and so they are, you know, defined by their very essence is their community-ness, their localness, and yet here we see them in both of these cases, in this national policy initiative with the TACT policy, and also with these new global partnerships. In both cases, it's becoming really complicated, it seems, to be local, and maybe it's not possible anymore. So that's what I'm working on now, and I'm very interested if anyone wants to partner or work with me on those things. So that's all.
Wonderful time control.
Good.
So we have about 4 or 5 minutes for Q&A. Is there any question?
Sure.
About the same Singapore connection, and you mentioned about instrumental funding, and I was curious in your question of who's copying who, because you said MIT went there first, and I find it very interesting because I heard about the legislation in Congress. I'm not sure what stage it's at, about connecting education funding with federal education funding from NSF. Should it be instrumentally used? So I was curious, was there, maybe it's a conspiracy, but is there any connection between how the federal Department of Education is talking about funding colleges in relation to like conversations with MIT and using these global universities as prototypes? Is it like a market strategy to test out in Singapore and see if it works, and then
Well, I think what you're hearing is just a global policy narrative. There's this idea that now higher education should be serving in that way. That we should be, doing research is going to directly benefit companies, in Research Park or whatever, that then is going to benefit the economy. That's one of our main reasons for being now. And so I think, Singapore, they're able to quickly implement that policy, where here, we have to talk about it a whole lot first. We're not going to just quickly do it automatically. And so, yes, they'll do it first. And we may learn from some mistakes that get made in that process. But I think it's more just a function of structural realities of the two systems. Because they're faster, they get there ahead of us, where our government might like to quickly get higher ed to do what it wants, but can't get higher ed to do here. So.
A follow-up question?
Sure.
Do you think there's going to be so the idea of getting something faster, so do you think the way American universities are going is not just that we may follow this global discourse about how to fund stuff, but politically how to structure stuff so it's also funded as fast as everyone else? Is that going along with the funding ways, or is?
Well, I think it's coming from a separate problem in that our funding is being cut, and so out of necessity, then we have to figure out how to get things funded quickly, just to keep the lights on. Because our state funding, all our other funding is cut. That makes us turn and rely more heavily on these federal sources, and something I didn't go into in this presentation, but is also a piece of this, is the foundations that have particular objectives, technological objectives, for example, Gates Foundation, and we have to bow to their whim because we need their money. And so it does have an impact on the type of research that gets done, the way in which universities behave, and the way we conduct our operations. I think there are real threats to our system, our way of our academic system of governance, and we see that.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Just a comment, really, because I'm too doing research in Singapore, and I'm really struck by a number of things. One, the speed at which Singapore has developed. If you look at the 1960s, when it's really a colony, when it's really part of Malaysia, and it then becomes independent, its growth has gone like that, directly. It's 15th largest economy in the world, etc. I'm also struck by its educational kind of boldness. The school that I'm looking at in Singapore is the largest feeder school to Oxford and Cambridge. They get more students to go to Oxford and Cambridge than Eton. And so it is really astounding. Not only is it astounding, but the sense that it is a strategy that links the state with the school is what I'm struck by. And I wonder about Finland in terms of their own policy. I was just at Columbia University at one of these conferences, and the Finnish were presented as the model.
Sure.
And so, but there's something, one country seems to be more inward looking or more inward kind of driven, and Singapore seems to be constantly wanting to explode outward. And yeah, so I'm just about the policy making. I get a sense in Singapore that the policy is made outside of teachers, outside of. And in Singapore, what I was struck by in the presentation at Columbia is that they placed a lot of emphasis on the parents and the teachers being involved in the construction of ideas for reform, which I thought was even more a powerful idea there than here in the U.S. So,
well, I do think that Finland is outside looking in that they have a national story, kind of a narrative of this fear of Russia.
yes.
And that helps, what it
Yeah.
does is it creates this internal strength, right?
Yeah.
It creates this nationalism.
Yeah.
And so out of that, they become very unified.
Yeah.
Because they have this strong neighbor to be afraid of next door.
Right,
you know?
right.
And so I think in some way that really
Yeah.
helps them. And I think, I use a metaphor that makes sense of the way that these two institutions, or these two cultures function in regards to education is Singapore is a harbor, and that is who they
Right.
are.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
they're all about this network and exchange and foreign exchange of ideas. Whereas Finland is forestry. They're growing it. They're growing the trees, but they're growing a forest. And so of course they're interested in parents and teachers because they are growing it there.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so if you think about those are kind of
Two kind of organizing
yeah,
metaphors,
the
yeah.
way that they are
Yeah.
as cultures.
Yeah.
And I think, and what's interesting is that even though they have these global pressures that are the same. Singapore very much wants to develop the same types of industries that
Absolutely,
Finland has.
yes.
So they both have these same pressures pushing down.
Yeah.
But you have this very different response in the harbor,
Yeah.
network developing response, or let's grow this forest, this strong forest.
Yeah.
And so we still see, even in this time with these global pressures that are identical, really,
Yeah.
very unique cultural nation-state policy responses,
Yeah.
which I think is really fascinating. And also for me, very, makes me happy to think that there's always going to be this type of variety.
That's right.
No matter how much global pressure comes to be the same, it doesn't matter. We all, our culture has so much